Hi there, I'm Rosemary Barton. Here's what's at issue this week. After weeks of allegations, Canada has expelled a Chinese diplomat accused of targeting Conservative MP Michael Chong and his family overseas.
This is a decision we took seriously, we took with careful consideration in order to do the right thing and expel the Chinese diplomat.
This comes as the government confirms foreign agent registry legislation is finally on its way.
A foreign agents registry is going to be implemented in the coming months.
So let's bring in our panelists, Chantal Hebert, Andrew Coyne, Althia Raj, and joining us this week, Jason Markusoff. Good to see everybody. Chantal, I'm going to start with you. I guess one of the things people were wondering when Canada finally made this decision to expel a diplomat was, is this a sign that the government is reactive or proactive in its foreign policy response, and was it ultimately the right call?
I think most people watching from the outside would be hard-pressed to call it proactive, considering that they were kind of dragged to the realization that this had happened, that they had not somehow let it fall through the cracks and then needed to take action. I'm not going after them on the notion that it took X number of days, because I do understand that in other G7 countries, it is the practice to give China or others the option of moving their diplomat away before he or she is declared persona non grata. And usually you give them a couple of days, not just 2 hours to decide. So I think that was part and parcel of the decision. But beyond that, no, I think they've been reactive. They have been slow to realize that this issue had legs, and they've been in reactive mode, and sometimes with a delay ever since this debate started.
Andrew?
What's that line of Churchill's about the Americans? They can always be counted on to do the right thing after they've exhausted every other alternative. That's what we seem to be getting here. Eventually they come around to the decision to establish a foreign agent registry. Eventually maybe we might have a public inquiry. Eventually maybe we'll find out what on earth was going on inside those high offices when these stream of intelligence reports were coming up to them, warning about what China was up to. But it always seems to take them a long time, and they seem very reluctant and unwilling. It's fine. I understand Chantal's point about, diplomatic niceties leave them time to get out on their own steam. But we've got some yards to make up with China. They have been running us ragged for some time. They have been interfering in our politics at every level. They have been intimidating our citizens. They've recently been caught red-handed intimidating one of our MPs. At that point, I think you need to be a little bit less tactful and a little bit more brusque with them. We need to, if I can borrow a phrase, make an example here. And to be spending a week publicly agonizing over what China might do in response, basically you might as well take out an ad saying we can be intimidated.
And I wondered, Althia, how that is viewed not only by China, but by allies or other countries in the world, that it would take us some time to do all the things that Andrew's talking about.
Well, I don't know. I haven't called the inner workings of the capitals around the world, but from the media coverage, you get the sense that there is obviously interest because it has made the news in other countries, in the US and the UK notably. I think Andrew raises an interesting point in kind of separating, and I don't know if he meant to do this or not, but as a foreign policy issue and a domestic policy issue, because the reason that the government was forced to respond on the Michael Chong stuff was because it became a domestic political issue. It became a hot issue domestically, not because they had this come to Jesus moment about foreign policy, because if so, it would have been more than one diplomat likely. There would have been a policy response to it, and it wasn't that. It was very reactive, and we talked about this last week, but if we yank the credentials of 7 Russian diplomats because of one Russian ex-spy being poisoned in the UK, it's kind of odd that we would just send one person packing in this case.
Jason?
I mean, I don't think there was any Liberal Party official who was boasting that this was a proactive move. Forget the 1 week delay. This is 2 years after the offending act occurred that this is being responded to. It's not like anybody in the government is also saying, we are now enacting the first tranche or the second tranche or tranche whatever of our Indo-Pacific strategy. exactly. This was, in response to something that happened 2 years ago that, as Althia says, is now attracting heat. And, Canada seems to remain cautious. They're not putting in, when they do talk about putting in their foreign agent registry, they're going to do it after consultation, after some legislative process, and who knows when we're actually going to see anybody actually having to register.
And they announced it a year ago.
The foreign agent registry. It only took all of these stories for them to actually go ahead and get it moving.
Yeah, well,
Chantal.
this is the government that's known for months that it would need a new RCMP commissioner, and here we are with an interim. On the allies looking at us, yes, the story that's consuming us is China interference, but the story of interest to many of our allies is leaky CSIS. And an accumulation of leaks to the newspapers. And why is that? Because a lot of countries are not too keen to share intelligence with the sieve. And the impression from the outside is that we have a security service that is leaking left, right, and center. And that is a more major concern, I would argue, to many allies than the issue of Chinese interference that they all are keeping an eye on.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Well, maybe not Chinese interference, but there is certainly a realignment going on around the world where people are taking very clear lines that we have to contain China, that we cannot view it as merely a competitor anymore. It is an adversary, and it's going to be definitely of interest in other capitals where and how what Canada is prepared to do in that regard. So if the reason that these leaks have been coming is that we have been signaling failing to do anything on this regard, that the government have been so committed, had basically bet the farm on this overture to China in the early years of this government, and has been, I think, reluctant to kind of admit that it had failed, then I think that's also of interest to foreign capitals. I agree with the point that nobody likes seeing secrets being leaked, but I think the reasons why these were being leaked is probably also of interest to foreign capitals.
And also what the retaliation will be from China.
But still,
hard to imagine it's just tit for tat.
But bottom line, it is as damaging to Canada's reputation, the perception that our security services are leaking and leaky, as it is that we are not proactive on issues that have engaged our allies. Both come at a price.
Just about a minute, Althia, but I mean, the Indo-Pacific strategy, to Jason's point, is in part, at least, in response to China and the things that Andrew's talking about there. And that policy itself talked about how China was increasingly disruptive.
Yeah, but it's many years late, much like the government's realization that China poses a much bigger threat than they first expected. Right. And I think that's where, like, the blind spots are. Like, when you go through who knew what and when, and yes, government set the tone, and now that the Prime Minister has said, I want to know everything should come to my desk, that's important. But it's also important that the public service take the issue seriously. And so it's odd. Yes, I know, according to the reports, there were no necessarily a named MP in that report, and the allegations were a little bit vague, but if you're the National Security Advisor and you think that this is very important, even though your replacement comes in and that person goes on vacation and somebody else is acting, there is still an expectation that one would take this seriously. Yeah. And I think that is, speaks to the fact that foreign policy actually is not treated that seriously in this country.
Culture.
We are very focused on inward-looking domestic policies, social policy, and these things are, we've known about them, we put them on the very far back burner and hope that nothing erupts, so we have to deal with it.
Welcome back to At Issue. Alberta's election campaign has a little more than 2 weeks left, but now wildfires are raging across the province. The military is being deployed to some of the danger zones in the province as other people, thousands actually, have been evacuated. Alberta Elections says it is evaluating the conditions for voting per riding.
We're just continuing to monitor the situation very closely, and we need to be able to decide if we can still offer voting locations. So for communities that have been evacuated, we're looking at where they've been evacuated to. Can we still offer voting services in the places that they've been evacuated to?
So should Alberta consider postponing the election? And this is the critical, I think, political question. How can this kind of crisis affect a campaign? Let's bring in everyone. Chantal, Althia, Andrew, and Jason. Jason, this is why you're here. You can't have all the time, but you can certainly start us off. I mean, we saw everybody sort of suspend their campaigns at the beginning, and certainly the Premier is having to campaign and manage things. Is there a sense of, do you have a sense of how this could affect the campaign and how people are doing in it?
It's hard to say. I mean, what this does give us a chance, and what it gives Danielle a chance is to show, Danielle Smith a chance is to show how she can perform as Premier in a crisis mode. Alberta's had a lot of crisis modes, a lot of emergencies over time, going back to Rachel Notley with the Fort McMurray fire in 2016, certainly Jason Kenney with the pandemic, and now Danielle Smith gets her first crisis. And she's generally acting as a Premier does in a time of crisis, showing leadership, being responsive to questions, urging people to follow authorities, pretty ordinary things. Interestingly, she had an audience on Sunday with Notley, her now opposition leader, and they went out together in a nice gesture during a campaign to meet some of the evacuees in Edmonton. It's going to be hard to say what kind of what this does to the election, other than suspending it a bit. One thing I would consider though is that not the whole province is on fire. It's in the north, north and around Edmonton, especially west of Edmonton. In Calgary, we don't feel the smoke, we don't sense it, so it may not wash over or impact us as much down here. And of course, as you know, Calgary is where most of the seats are and much of the battleground is.
Yeah, Chantal.
Well, as you know, in this province, Lucien Bouchard, when he was Premier, went way up in the polls for his handling of an ice storm.
That's right.
So these events and the way they're handled, and the reverse can also happen. A mayor of Montreal didn't show up when the city was flooded. And bad things happen. But I think, on balance, I can't talk to the timing of the election, but this crisis and the way it was handled by Danielle Smith will probably, in hindsight, be seen as a plus for her campaign rather than a minus.
Althia?
I don't know yet, because I think we're still kind of in the middle of it. I think what it does raise is other issues, so like the news that the news 3 years ago, that the UCP had cut some of the elite forest fires group for the guys who come down in the helicopters. And so it kind of raises other issues that you don't expect to become political issues during a campaign, and that can go in all sorts of direction. But I do agree, I don't think anybody would agree otherwise, that it does give the candidate a chance to look very statesman-like, how they would handle a crisis. And it's kind of ironic in a way that she is having this opportunity at the same time as voters are also being reminded that if she was in the chair during the COVID-19 pandemic, the result would have been drastically different. So all of it speaks to trust.
I wonder too, though, Andrew, if it to Althia's point there, if it takes some of the focus off those other stories that probably would have been more prominent in these days, because you have to ask the Premier some questions about how things are unfolding and her next steps, instead of maybe asking just questions about things that are maybe deserving of many questions.
Yeah, it's full of risks at the same time. That could all go south on her in a hurry if she's seen not to care, or if she's seen to be trying to exploit it, or 1,000 other things. Politics is performance art. These are moments when you have a chance to either put your foot right or put your foot wrong. And how much the Premier of the province actually is involved in or responsible for the details of fighting the fires is not great, but they have to be seen in, as I say, in this leadership/performing role. But it's a delicate art. We saw this with that very carefully staged meeting between her and Rachel Notley, where they both had to show up, they both had to profess to be putting Alberta first, but they would be thinking throughout, how's the camera angle here?
So Jason, is there a sense right now, I mean, the calls for postponing it they're growing in the areas where, as you say, there are wildfires. Is there a sense whether that would benefit anyone, either party in any way, and whether that is likely to happen at all?
I'd say the likelihood seems low at this point. Right now, they've made some headways with the fires. Some people are returning home, but it's looking like it's going to be a lot of hot, dry, and dry weather this this weekend. So who knows what can happen? I mean, having gone through some of the many wildfires that we seem to be getting at an increasing clip here in Alberta and the West. 2 weeks is a long time to go, and it's unlikely that evacuations would last that long necessarily. So people may be back, they may not be. If anything is delayed, it would be in a few rural ridings west of Edmonton and north of Edmonton, and those ridings aren't in play. So one of the scenarios that's been sketched out for us is maybe if two ridings have to have a postponed election or have remote voting, and it's 43-42. Then we don't know for maybe a few weeks or so what the result is. But it's a pretty safe bet that if it's that tight and there are two ridings up and those are UCP ridings. But I think that's probably getting way ahead of ourselves at this point to sketch out those fun scenarios.
I can't stay in Alberta more than like a week, so I'm not going to be there till the very end.
Oh, that's why you're so interested. I just figured it out. You are trying to answer the question.
Yeah, I'm trying to anticipate how long I'll be there. Let me ask this question, though, about a serious question about whether this raises questions about climate change and whether that then becomes a factor during this campaign in a different way. Who wants in there, Chantal?
Yes and no.
Yeah.
I don't think, well, I'm not there. Jason can answer this better than I can. But I don't think there is this sense that it will tilt the balance of the election because suddenly climate change is again being brought to the fore. I would be surprised.
Andrew?
Well, and also everyone professes to believe in climate change. So it's always, yes, I believe in climate change, but let's not do anything actually that would help to reduce emissions.
Althia?
I don't actually think this is an issue at all because we have forest fires in Alberta every year. I think the issue is, did the Premier respond adequately? And do people feel like the resources were deployed quickly enough? I think that's where the conversation will turn. I don't think this is going to become a big debate about whether climate change exists or not.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Jason, for being here and offering your Calgary/Alberta expertise. Appreciate it.